Chapter 38, Section 4.
The expanded war sparks increased protest. By the time Nixon entered office in 1969, some 30,000 Americans had already died in Vietnam. During his first year as president, 11,500 more died and 55,000 were wounded. Over the next 3 years, however, Vietnamization drastically cut U.S. casualties as more and more soldiers came home. Their ARVN replacements, though, had not yet shown they could stand up to an NVA assault. They got another chance in the spring of 1972. On March 30th, North Vietnamese troops backed by tanks and artillery invaded South Vietnam. They smashed through the ARVN defenders at the border. The U.S. military, with just 6,000 soldiers left in the country, provided air power to counter the invasion. Then Nixon took a bolder step. In April, for the first time since 1969, he unleashed U.S. bombers on North Vietnam. He also ordered the mining of Haiphong and other North Vietnamese ports, where war supplies from the Soviet Union and China arrived. His stated goal was to destroy the enemy's war-making capacity. By mid-June, the North's offensive had been shut down, and ARVN forces had begun pushing their invaders back. Nixon declares, "Peace is at hand." North Vietnam's failed invasion caused it to soften its stand at the secret Paris peace talks. North Vietnamese negotiators withdrew their demand that South Vietnam's government share power with the Viet Cong. For its part, the United States stopped its bombing and agreed that some NVA forces could stay in the South. These compromises allowed Henry Kissinger to reach an agreement with Hanoi's diplomats. At a news conference less than 2 weeks before the 1972 presidential election, Kissinger announced, "We believe that peace is at hand." By that time, polls showed that Nixon already had a large lead over Democratic candidate George McGovern, an anti-war senator. Nixon went on to win a second term in a landslide. But peace was not at hand. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, feared that the United States was abandoning his country to the communists. He insisted on dozens of changes to the Paris Agreement. Learning of the changes, Hanoi's leaders backed out, and the peace talks collapsed. Frustrated by the failed talks, Nixon decided to punish the North. On December 14th, he ordered a series of B-52 and fighter bomber attacks on Hanoi and Haiphong. Known as the Christmas bombings, this aerial campaign reached an intensity not previously seen in the war. One NVA leader said it was like living through a typhoon with trees crashing down and lightning transforming night into day. Nixon hoped to destroy North Vietnam's will to fight. He also wanted to show President Thieu that after peace came, the United States would use its might to enforce the terms of the treaty. North Vietnam returned to the bargaining table, and South Vietnam agreed to earlier proposals. By late January, the negotiators had a final treaty ready to sign. On January 27, 1973, representatives of the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. This treaty set the goal of ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. To that end, it established a ceasefire and kept the dividing line between North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. It also called for withdrawal of all U.S. troops and the release of all U.S. prisoners of war. Veterans and prisoners of war returned home. By March 29, 1973, the United States had withdrawn all combat forces from Vietnam. Arriving home, many soldiers were dismayed to find themselves the victims of their country's bitter debate over the war. Unlike soldiers returning from World War II, most Vietnam veterans were not treated like heroes. Few communities welcomed their soldiers back with parades or celebrations. Instead, Vietnam veterans were often shunned or simply ignored by the general public. As a result, they did not receive the support and understanding they deserved for their service and sacrifices. For combat veterans especially, the Vietnam War had been a harrowing experience. Many soldiers were haunted by their fears in battle and by the death and destruction they had witnessed. They rarely talked about their combat experiences, except with other veterans. Of the 2.6 million Americans who served in Vietnam, nearly 500,000 suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms of this mental illness include anxiety, irritability, nightmares, and depression. More than 760 Americans were taken prisoners by the North Vietnamese. Of these prisoners of war, or POWs, at least 110 died in captivity. The typical POW was a pilot whose plane had been shot down. POWs lived in miserable conditions, often in solitary confinement, and they faced regular interrogations and torture. One former POW described his experience in a Hanoi prison. From the moment you enter a political prison, you are told and forced to act as though you were subhuman, a dreg of society, and there's every effort made to remind you daily that they're looking at you. You're not to look at the sky. That's enough to give you a left hook to the jaw. You're to bow down. You have no rights. You have no name. You have no nationality. You are a criminal. You are a worm. Navy pilot James Stockdale shot down in 1965. North Vietnam had released all POWs by April 1st, 1973. Another 2,600 Americans were MIA, or missing in action. Some 1,800 MIAs are still unaccounted for today. Few, if any, are thought to be alive.